A 4-year-old waif stumbles upon a millionaire being buried alive alongside his 3 newborn sons, but she emerges at the last instant and does the unexpected. Comment giving a score from 0 to 10 for my story. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The small girl of 4 years walked through the streets of the big city with uncertain steps, her bare little feet touching the cold asphalt while hunger tightened her empty stomach. Despite her age, her frail and malnourished body made her seem only 2 years old, a child lost amid the urban chaos that ignored her completely. Her tangled hair fell over her dirty face, and the torn clothes barely covered her fragile figure. The sun began to set, painting the sky with orange tones that contrasted with the harshness of the streets. The girl had learned that these were the most dangerous moments when shadows lengthened and strange people began to circulate through the alleys. She searched desperately for some leftover food in the trash near the restaurants, her small hands poking among dirty papers and empty packaging. For 3 months, since losing her parents in a terrible accident, she had wandered alone through the streets, surviving on the occasional charity of hurried passers-by and the few food she could find. The memory of the fateful day still haunted her, the deafening noise, the screams, and then the silence. She had woken up in the hospital alone, with no one to pick her up. The staff tried to find relatives, but there was no one. That was when life on the streets began. That afternoon, while walking through a more remote area of the city, something caught her attention. Muffled cries echoed from a nearby vacant lot, sounds that did not seem normal. Her childish curiosity, mixed with an instinct she had developed on the streets, made her approach cautiously. The place was surrounded by tall grass and accumulated garbage, a place that most people avoided. The cries became clearer as she approached. They were voices of despair, muffled pleas that made her small heart race. Sneaking among the bushes, she could see a scene that shocked her deeply. Several hooded men surrounded a deep hole in the ground, and inside it she could distinguish a male figure, along with something that seemed to be babies. The man in the hole was young, appearing about 30 years old, with features that, even dirty with dirt and distorted by terror, revealed a striking beauty. His dark hair was disheveled, and his expensive clothes, now torn and dirty, indicated that he did not belong to that sordid place. His desperate eyes begged for mercy as he held 3 small children against his chest. The girl could not fully understand what was happening, but her instinct told her that something terrible was about to occur. The hooded men spoke in low and threatening tones, gesturing with shovels and sacks of earth. It was obvious that they intended to bury the man and the babies alive. Without thinking about the consequences, moved by a protective impulse that she herself did not understand, the child began to look for stones on the ground. Her small hands found some fragments of concrete and pebbles. With all the strength that her fragile body allowed, she began to hurl them in the direction of the kidnappers. The first projectile hit one of the men in the head, making him scream in pain and surprise. The confusion that followed was exactly what the situation needed. The criminals, frightened by the possibility of witnesses, began to look for the origin of the projectiles, allowing the man in the hole to have some precious seconds to act. Taking advantage of the distraction, the businessman managed to propel one of the babies out of the hole, shouting for someone to catch him. The girl, without hesitating, ran and held the small child, protecting him with her own body. The screams and confusion increased, and suddenly sirens began to sound in the distance. The hooded men, realizing that the situation had gotten out of control, fled, leaving behind their victims. The businessman, still in shock, managed to get out of the hole with the other 2 babies, trembling with terror and relief. His eyes met those of the little girl who had saved their lives, and at that moment, something profound passed between them. The sirens were approaching rapidly, but the child, by instinct developed on the streets, began to move away. She had learned to distrust any type of authority, fearing being taken to some place where she could suffer even more. The man, noticing her hesitation, extended a trembling hand in her direction. Their eyes met again, and she saw something in them that made her stop. It was not pity or charity, but a deep gratitude mixed with something she could not identify. The businessman, still holding the two babies, approached slowly, as if he were dealing with a frightened animal. The lights of emergency vehicles already illuminated the vacant lot when the fate of that 4-year-old waif began to take a completely unexpected turn. The businessman knelt on the muddy ground, still trembling from the trauma, while observing the small figure who had saved his life and the babies. The girl kept her distance, her big and distrustful eyes following his every movement. Even in the growing darkness, he could see the extreme malnutrition stamped on her little face, the fragility that made her seem like a broken doll. The authorities arrived in force, with ambulances, patrol cars, and investigators who quickly surrounded the site. The man, who identified himself as a successful businessman in the city, quickly explained what had happened, but his eyes did not stray from the child who remained there, as if she were a ghost about to disappear. She firmly held the small, torn backpack that carried all her belongings, some pieces of stale bread, a half-empty water bottle, and a yellowed photo of people who had once been her family. During the questioning, he discovered disturbing details about the kidnapping. The criminals had planned everything meticulously, choosing that isolated location specifically because there was rarely any movement. The fact that an abandoned child had appeared exactly at the right moment seemed impossible, almost as if fate had intervened. The babies, all appearing to be a few months old, were immediately taken to hospitals for medical examinations. The girl watched all the movement with fascination and terror mixed. She had never seen so many important people gathered in one place, all talking quickly and taking notes. When one of the investigators approached her to ask questions, she recoiled instinctively, hiding behind a pile of rubble. Her experience on the streets had taught her that adults asking questions usually meant trouble. The businessman noticed the child's fear and, against all expectations, gently dismissed the investigators who were trying to question her. He approached slowly, as he would with an injured animal, and sat on the ground at the same height as her. His voice, when he finally spoke, was soft and careful, very different from the authoritarian tone he used in his multi-million-dollar business. "You saved our lives," he said simply, watching how she reacted to his words. "I don't know how to thank you for something like that." The girl did not respond, but her eyes fixed on him with an intensity disturbing for someone so young. There was something in that look that made him feel as if she could see through all the masks he wore in the business world, straight to something deeper and truer. When the investigators finished the initial work and began to disperse, the businessman made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He could not simply let that child go back to the streets, not after what she had done. His fortune, accumulated through shrewd investments in stocks and properties, could easily provide a decent life for her. "Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" he asked, already knowing the answer from the state she was in. Her silent refusal confirmed his suspicions. She was completely alone in the world, a reality he knew all too well. Since losing his wife in traumatic circumstances 2 years earlier, he had also experienced a deep loneliness, even surrounded by all his wealth and business success. The proposal he made was careful, almost hesitant. He offered to take the girl to his mansion, just for that night, so she could take a hot bath, eat a proper meal, and sleep in a real bed. He promised that if she wanted to leave the next morning, he would provide resources for her to find a safe place to stay. The distrust in her eyes was palpable, but hunger and exhaustion spoke louder. After long minutes of hesitation, she agreed with an almost imperceptible nod of her head. The businessman felt a strange satisfaction with that small victory, as if he had gained the trust of something wild and precious. The trip to the mansion was made in silence. The girl was curled up in the back seat of the luxury car, watching the city lights pass by the window with wide eyes. She had never been inside such an expensive vehicle, with leather seats that smelled of wealth and a softness that contrasted drastically with the harshness of the streets she knew. The property where he lived was impressive even by the standards of the city's elite. Tall electronic gates opened automatically, revealing a circular driveway with ornate fountains and perfectly manicured gardens. The house itself was a majestic construction, with 3 floors and classic architecture that spoke of generations of money and power. Inside the mansion, each room was a demonstration of good taste and abundant resources. Antique furniture mixed with modern technology, creating an environment that was both welcoming and intimidating. The girl walked behind him like a shadow, her bare feet making minimal noise on the polished marble floors. The first stop was the kitchen, where a maid was still working despite the late hour. The woman, middle-aged and maternal-looking, was visibly shocked to see the child's condition, but followed the discreet instructions of her boss to prepare a simple and nutritious meal. While the girl ate voraciously, the businessman watched her every move with an intensity that bordered on obsession. There was something in that child that awakened contradictory feelings in him. Genuine protection mixed with a need for control that he could not completely explain. The bath was the next step, supervised by the maid, who discovered the extent of the neglect the girl had suffered. Her skin was marked by small wounds and scars from the streets, evidence of a life that no child should know. When she emerged clean, wearing new clothes that had been quickly provided, her transformation was impressive. The room he offered her was bigger than any place she had slept in her entire life. The king-size bed was covered with silk sheets, and expensive toys were scattered strategically around the room. It was as if he had tried to create the perfect room for a child, but something in the decoration seemed forced, almost theatrical. When he left her alone to rest, the businessman stood outside the door for several minutes, listening to the low sounds she made as she settled in. For the first time in months, he felt that his life had a purpose beyond business and investments. That little girl had saved more than his physical life. She had saved something in his soul that he thought was lost forever. But as she finally fell asleep in the luxurious bed, surrounded by more comfort than she had ever experienced, neither of them could imagine that that night marked only the beginning of a journey far more complex and dangerous than either of them could anticipate. The girl woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented by the softness of the bed and the absolute silence that contrasted with the constant noises of the streets. For a few seconds, she thought that everything had been just a dream. The handsome man, the luxurious mansion, the feeling of safety that she had not experienced for months. But when her eyes adjusted to the partial darkness of the room, illuminated only by a discreet nightlight, the reality of her new situation set in. She got up silently, her small feet touching a soft carpet that cost more than many people earned in a year. Childish curiosity, mixed with the survival instinct developed on the streets, made her carefully explore the environment. The room was larger than entire apartments she had seen, with furniture that seemed to come out of fairy tales and a panoramic view of the city through huge windows. During the exploration, she discovered that the door was unlocked, which surprised her. In the few times she had slept in temporary shelters, the doors were always locked to keep her inside. The apparent freedom made her curious about the rest of the house, but also slightly suspicious. Adults who were too kind usually hid ulterior motives. She decided to venture through the silent corridors of the mansion. Each step was calculated not to make noise, a skill she had perfected during her nights on the streets avoiding dangers. The corridors were lined with expensive paintings and oriental rugs that muffled any sound of her movements. It was during this night exploration that she heard low voices coming from an office on the ground floor. The businessman's voice was unmistakable, but there was something different in his tone. a coldness that was not present when he spoke to her. She approached the half-open door with the care of someone who had learned to spy to survive. "The babies are safe at the agreed location," he said on the phone, his voice laden with a tension she could not fully understand. "Today's incident complicated things, but it can be used to our advantage." There was a pause while the person on the other side spoke, and then he continued. "The girl, she can be useful. An innocent witness always adds credibility to our version of the facts." The word sounded strange to her, who did not fully understand the meaning, but something in her instinct warned her that something was wrong. The cold and calculating tone was very different from the gentleness he had shown a few hours before. She kept listening, trying to understand. "No, she suspects nothing. She's just an abandoned child, desperate for any kindness. It will be easy to keep her under control." His voice had a metallic quality that made the girl shudder. "When the authorities return for more questioning, she will confirm everything we need them to believe." The child's stomach contracted with a sense of familiar fear. There was something in his words that echoed all the times adults had lied to her or used her for their own purposes. She moved away from the door silently, her small heart beating fast as she processed what she had heard. Back in the room, she sat on the edge of the huge bed, trying to understand the situation. The man had saved the babies that she had seen with her own eyes, but there was something about the way he talked about everything that didn't sound right. Her limited but harsh experience on the streets had taught her to trust her instincts when words didn't match actions. The next morning, the businessman appeared with a warm smile and breakfast served on silver trays. The transformation in his personality was complete. He went back to being the gentle and protective man from the night before. He watched her as she ate, his eyes shining with a satisfaction she could not fully identify. "Sleep well?" he asked, sitting next to her on the bed with a familiarity that made her feel slightly uncomfortable. "I hope you liked the room. We can change anything you want." The girl nodded silently, but her eyes studied him with new attention. There were details she had not noticed before. The way his smiles did not fully reach his eyes, the way his hands moved with calculated gestures, the rehearsed quality of his kindness. During breakfast, he explained his plans for her with growing enthusiasm. He talked about how she could stay in the mansion permanently, how he would provide private education and all the luxuries a child could desire. He mentioned expensive clothes, imported toys, even a private pool where she could learn to swim. "You'll never have to worry about food or shelter again," he said, his voice charged with an intensity that made her recoil slightly. "I'll take care of everything. All I need in return is for you to trust me completely." The word trust echoed strangely in her mind, reminding her of the phone conversation the night before. There was something in the way he emphasized the word that sounded more like a demand than a request. Her survival instincts, sharpened by months on the streets, began to send warning signals. After breakfast, he took her on a tour of the property. The gardens were impressive, with elaborate fountains and exotic plants that must have cost a fortune to maintain. There was a complete recreation area, with playground equipment that seemed never to have been used. Everything was too perfect, like a scenario set specifically to impress. During the walk, she noticed something strange. There were employees everywhere, gardeners, maids, security guards, but they all avoided eye contact with her. When she tried to smile or wave, they quickly looked away, as if they had received specific instructions not to interact. The businessman explained that all the employees were very discreet and professional, trained not to bother the inhabitants of the house. But there was something in the way he said that, a rigidity in his posture, that made the girl wonder if there were other reasons for the strange behavior of the employees. At the end of the tour, they arrived at an area of the house that he identified as his private quarters. There was a staircase that led to an attic, but when she showed curiosity about what was up there, he quickly changed the subject, directing her attention to other parts of the property. "Some areas of the house are just for adults," he explained with a smile that did not seem completely genuine. "Boring work documents, nothing that would interest a smart little girl like you." But the speed with which he diverted her attention from that specific area only increased her curiosity. There was something in the attic that he didn't want her to see, and her experience had taught her that adults hiding things usually meant danger. As the day progressed, the girl began to notice other strange details. The windows on the upper floor had special locks, too elaborate for simple security measures. The exit doors of the property were constantly monitored by cameras and guards, creating a feeling more of luxurious imprisonment than of welcoming home. When it was time for dinner, served in a formal dining room that could accommodate 20 people, she felt lost in the immensity of the space. The businessman sat at the head of the long table, talking animatedly about future plans while she ate in silence, processing everything she had observed during the day. At night, when he tucked her into bed with excessive care, checking multiple times if she was comfortable, the girl pretended to fall asleep quickly. But as soon as she heard his footsteps fading down the hall, her eyes opened, alert and watchful. There were many unanswered questions, and her intuition told her that the answers might be more disturbing than she was prepared to discover. 3 weeks had passed since the girl arrived at the mansion, and her routine had been established in a strangely rigid way. Every morning, the businessman appeared in her room with breakfast served on the silver tray, always with a warm smile that she had learned to recognize as performative. He talked about plans for the day, but noticed that all the proposed activities took place exclusively within the property. The private education he had promised began in the 2nd week, but the hired tutor was a cold and distant woman who avoided any conversation that was not related to the lessons. During the math and English classes, the girl noticed that the teacher often looked at the clock as if she was anxious to finish and leave. She never stayed beyond the strictly necessary time. The child's attempts to ask questions about the outside world were systematically diverted. When she asked about other children, public parks, or even how the babies who had been saved were doing, the businessman skillfully changed the subject, directing the conversation to the luxuries available on the property. His answers were always vague and accompanied by offers of new toys or activities. During her secret nightly explorations, which became more frequent and cautious, the girl discovered that the mansion had many more rooms than she had initially imagined. There were entire rooms that remained locked, corridors that led to places she could never reach, and always that mysterious attic he had mentioned quickly on the first day. One night, while silently walking through the corridors, she again heard voices coming from the office. This time, there were more people present, and the conversation seemed more tense than before. She approached the door with the care developed during her months on the streets, controlling even her breathing so as not to be detected. "The families are getting more desperate," said a female voice she did not recognize. "2 have already gone to the press. We need to speed up the timeline." "The situation is under control," the businessman responded, but there was a tension in his voice that contradicted his words. "The waif has been helpful exactly as we planned. The authorities have completely bought our version of events." "What if she starts asking inconvenient questions?" asked another man. "Children of that age are unpredictable." "She's not going anywhere to ask questions." The businessman's response was accompanied by a cold laugh that made the girl shrink. "And even if she tried, who would believe the word of a street urchin against mine?" The conversation continued with details she could not fully understand, but the words "desperate families" echoed in her mind disturbingly. There was something about babies, fake documents and payments that sounded increasingly sinister. When she heard footsteps approaching the door, she ran silently back to her room. The next morning, the businessman's behavior seemed even more controlling. He announced that he had hired a nanny to help take better care of her, a woman who would arrive at the end of the week. The way he mentioned this news with a smile that didn't reach his eyes made the girl feel a chill in her stomach. "She's very experienced with children," he explained during breakfast. "She'll make sure you have everything you need and that you never feel alone or tempted to explore places where you shouldn't." The last part of the sentence was said with a forced gentleness that sounded more like a threat than concern. The girl nodded silently, but mentally began to make plans. There was something happening in that house that went far beyond simple gratitude for having saved his life. During lunch, served in the garden under a pergola covered in flowers, she made a disturbing discovery. While the businessman answered a work call, pretending to be interested in the ornamental fish in the nearby fountain, she noticed a man on the other side of the high wall surrounding the property. The man was middle-aged, dressed in simple gardener's clothes, but there was something about his movements that caught her attention. He wasn't just tending the plants, he was watching the house with an intensity that seemed personal. When their eyes met for a brief moment, she saw something in them that she recognized, the same pain and hopelessness she had seen in her own reflection during her months on the streets. The businessman ended the call and turned to her with renewed attention, but she had mentally recorded every detail of the man on the outside of the wall. There was something familiar about his face, a connection she couldn't fully identify, but that sparked a strange sense of recognition. That afternoon, during English class with the silent tutor, the girl pretended to be focused on the exercises while watching out the window. The same man was there again, now genuinely working in the garden of a neighboring property, but his eyes frequently turned toward the mansion where she was. When the class ended and the tutor left with her usual haste, the girl made a risky decision. She waited until she was sure the businessman was busy in his office, then quietly headed to the garden area closest to the wall. There was a large tree whose branches extended to near the property line. Climbing trees was a skill she had developed during her months on the streets, looking for safe places to sleep. Her movements were agile and silent, and in a few minutes she was on a branch that offered a clear view of the neighboring garden. The man was there, pruning bushes with mechanical movements, but when he noticed her presence, he stopped immediately. They looked at each other for a few seconds in total silence. There was something in his eyes that reminded her of her own pain, a deep sadness mixed with determination. Slowly, he approached the wall, keeping his movements casual, as if he were just changing position to work. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his words almost inaudible. The simple question carried so much weight that she felt tears prick her eyes. It had been weeks since anyone genuinely asked about her well-being. She nodded hesitantly, but there was doubt in her gesture. "If you need help, leave something yellow in this tree," he said quickly, looking around to make sure they weren't being watched. "I'll be watching." Before she could respond, she heard the businessman's voice calling her name from inside the mansion. Panic washed over her, and she climbed down the tree with the speed developed by the need to escape dangers on the streets. When she reached the main garden, he was walking toward her with a worried expression that seemed genuine. "Where were you, little one?" he asked, but there was something in his eyes that made her realize that the concern was more about control than care. "I was looking for you. I was just playing in the garden," she replied, with the forced innocence she had learned to use as protection. He examined her for a few seconds, as if trying to detect lies, then smiled and placed his hand on her shoulder with a firmness that bordered on possessive. "It's better to play in the areas near the house. The garden is big, and I don't want you to get lost." That night, during the formal dinner served in the intimidating dining room, the businessman announced that the nanny would arrive the next day. He described the woman as very efficient and an expert in ensuring that children follow proper routines. Each word sounded like another barrier being erected around her. When she was finally put to bed, with the same excessive care as always, the girl remained awake, thinking about the man in the neighboring garden. There was something in his offer of help that sounded genuine. Unlike all the controlled interactions she had experienced in the mansion, for the first time in weeks she felt a small spark of hope that she might not be completely alone in her increasingly disturbing situation. The nanny arrived on a rainy Thursday morning, bringing with her an atmosphere of coldness that spread through the mansion like a dark cloud. The woman was approximately 40 years old, with black hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything with a calculating precision. Her clothes were impeccable but austere, and her rigid posture suggested years of practice in intimidating children. "This is the lady who will take care of you," announced the businessman with forced enthusiasm, presenting the woman as if she were a special gift. "She has a lot of experience and will make sure you have the best education and discipline." The word discipline was pronounced with an emphasis that made the girl shrink instinctively. The nanny observed the child from head to toe, as if she were evaluating an object she had just acquired, and her smile did not convey any maternal warmth. "We're going to get along very well," said the woman, her voice laden with an authority that did not admit questioning, "as long as certain rules are followed to the letter." The first rule established was that the girl could no longer move freely around the house. There were specific times for each activity: breakfast at 7, classes from 8 to noon, lunch followed by a mandatory rest period, more classes in the afternoon, dinner at 6, and bedtime at 8. Any deviation from this schedule would result in educational consequences. The second rule was even more restrictive. She could no longer go out into the garden without direct supervision. The nanny explained that there were dangerous elements in the external environment that could harm a child so young and vulnerable. When the girl timidly asked what kind of dangers, the response was vague but threatening. "There are bad people in this world who like to hurt little children," said the woman, approaching her with deliberately intimidating movements. "People who pretend to be friends to get what they want. You wouldn't want to meet those kinds of people, would you?" Classes also changed drastically. The previous tutor, although cold, at least taught normal academic subjects. The new routine included long sessions on proper behavior, where the nanny incessantly repeated the rules of conduct expected of a well-behaved child. Any questions about the outside world were immediately reprimanded as inappropriate curiosity. During the first weekend under the new regime, the girl discovered that her nightly explorations had become impossible. The nanny slept in the room next to hers, and any movement during the night resulted in her immediate appearance at the door, asking if there was a problem. It was clear that the woman slept with an ear always alert. The businessman, during this period, became an even more distant presence. He appeared only during some meals, always accompanied by the nanny, and his conversations with the girl were supervised and directed to safe topics. There was a theatricality in their interactions that suggested that the woman's presence served for more than just childcare. It was during one of these supervised meals that the girl overheard a disturbing conversation. The businessman received a call that he initially tried to ignore, but the insistence of the caller forced him to answer. The nanny signaled for the child to continue eating while paying obvious attention to the phone conversation. "No, it's not time yet," said the businessman in a low voice, but the dining room had acoustics that made his words clearly audible. "The situation needs to be completely stabilized before we take the next step." There was a pause while the person on the other side spoke, and then he continued. "The nanny is doing an excellent job. The child is completely under control now. No mobility, no external contacts, and most importantly, no asking inconvenient questions." The girl continued eating mechanically, but each word was engraved in her memory with disturbing clarity. The nanny watched both her and the phone conversation, clearly pleased with what she heard. "The documents are being prepared," continued the businessman. "As soon as we have the finalized legal paperwork, we can proceed with the final transfer. The buyer is getting impatient, but quality takes time." The word buyer echoed in the girl's mind like an alarm bell. On the streets, she had heard whispers about children who disappeared and were sold to bad people. She had never imagined that she could become part of something like that, especially not by someone she had saved from a terrible situation. After lunch, the nanny announced that it was time for mandatory rest, confining the girl to her room for 3 hours. During this forced period of isolation, she had time to process everything she had heard and observed in recent weeks. The pieces of a terrible puzzle began to fall into place. The man from the neighboring garden had offered help, but now she no longer had access to the tree that allowed communication with him. The nanny had made any independent movement impossible, creating a prison disguised as maternal care. And the phone conversations suggested that her presence in the mansion was part of a much larger and more sinister plan. During the afternoon, pretending to be interested in a children's book that the nanny had approved, the girl watched through the window of her room. The neighboring garden was visible from there, and she could see the man working with movements that seemed deliberately slow, as if he were waiting for some sign. She remembered his words about leaving something yellow in the tree if she needed help. She looked around the room, looking for any item of the specified color. Her new clothes were all in pastel tones approved by the nanny, but there was a small yellow ribbon on one of the teddy bears that decorated the room. The challenge would be how to get to the tree without being detected. The nanny made regular rounds, checking her location every 20 minutes. The windows of the room had special locks that she had noticed but had not dared to test. And even if she managed to get out, there were security cameras throughout the property. Late in the afternoon, during dinner, something happened that completely changed her perspective on the situation. The businessman received an unexpected visit, a well-dressed man who carried a briefcase of documents and a somber expression. The nanny immediately escorted the girl to her room, but not before she heard fragments of the conversation. "The families are organizing," said the visitor with evident urgency. "They've hired a private investigator. We need to speed everything up." "How much time do we have?" asked the businessman, his voice laden with tension. "A week at most. After that, the situation will become unsustainable." As she was led upstairs by the nanny, the girl processed this information with a clarity that was surprising for someone of her age. There were families looking for something, probably for the babies who had been saved on that terrible night weeks ago. And she was being kept as part of a scheme that was about to be exposed. That night, lying in the luxurious bed that had become her gilded cage, the girl made a desperate decision. No matter the risks, she needed to find a way to contact the man from the neighboring garden. Her life, and possibly the lives of the babies she had helped save, depended on her ability to escape the nanny's constant surveillance and alert someone to what was happening in the mansion. Time was running out, and she could feel that events were accelerating towards an outcome that would be irreversible if she did not act quickly. The 4-year-old who had survived months on the streets would need to use all her cunning and courage to escape a trap far more sophisticated and dangerous than anything she had faced during her life of abandonment. The opportunity the girl was waiting for arose unexpectedly during a Tuesday morning. The nanny had developed a rigid routine that included a daily phone call at 10 o'clock in the morning, always made from the office on the ground floor. During those 15 minutes, she isolated herself completely, speaking in a low voice about matters that seemed extremely important and confidential. That specific morning, while pretending to be absorbed in a children's puzzle, the girl watched the woman descend the stairs with her habitual punctuality. She mentally counted to 60 before moving, a precaution learned during her months on the streets when timing was the difference between safety and danger. With silent movements developed by the need for survival, she headed for the window of her room. The special locks were more complicated than she had expected, but her small hands managed to manipulate the mechanism after several minutes of careful attempts. The sound of the click was almost inaudible, but to her it seemed as loud as a gunshot. The descent down the exterior wall was dangerous, but not impossible for someone who had spent nights on roofs and awnings looking for shelter. There was a decorative trellis that offered enough support, and in a few minutes her feet touched the soft lawn of the garden. The feeling of freedom, even if temporary, was overwhelming. She ran silently to the tree near the wall, her movements quick but cautious. The yellow ribbon from the teddy bear was firmly tied in her small hand, and she attached it to the most visible branch exactly as the man had instructed. For a few seconds she remained there, waiting for him to appear on the other side. It didn't take long. The man emerged from among the bushes of the neighboring garden, as if he had been waiting for this moment. When their eyes met, she saw a deep relief in his expression, mixed with an urgency that made her realize that he had been genuinely concerned about her situation. "You're in danger," he whispered, approaching the wall as much as possible. "I need you to listen to me carefully." His words confirmed her worst fears, but also brought a strange relief. Finally, someone was validating her suspicions and offering real help. She nodded vigorously, indicating that she was ready to hear anything he had to say. "My name doesn't matter now, but you need to know that I'm looking for my son," he said, his voice laden with a pain she recognized intimately. "He was taken 2 months ago. A 3-month-old baby." The girl felt her stomach clench. The babies who had been saved on that terrible night, one of them was this man's son. The revelation explained the intensity in his eyes, the determination she had perceived since their first meeting. "They weren't saved, were they?" she asked, her voice small but firm. "The babies from that night." The man closed his eyes for a moment, as if the confirmation was physical and painful. "No, it was all staged. They took my son and other babies from poor families that don't have the resources to fight back." "How do you know it was staged?" she asked, needing to fully understand the situation. "Because I recognized you," he said, watching her reaction carefully. "Your picture was in the newspapers a few months ago, a missing child, wanted by social services. They used you as an innocent witness to validate their story." The revelation hit her like lightning. She had been used from the first moment, not saved out of gratitude, but recruited as part of an elaborate plan. Everything, the dramatic rescue, the businessman's initial kindness, even her presence in that specific location, had been orchestrated. "Where are the babies now?" she asked, feeling a growing anger that surprised her with its intensity. "We don't know for sure, but we believe they are being kept in a safe house until they are transferred to the final buyers." The hesitation in his voice when mentioning the buyers made it clear that the children's fate would be terrible. The girl looked back at the mansion, calculating how much time she had before the nanny finished her phone call. "I heard them talking about documents and final transfer. They said they had a week." The man's face paled. "Then time is running out. I need you to help me find evidence inside the house. Something that proves what they are doing." "How can I do that? The nanny doesn't leave me alone for a minute." "There's an attic in the house that they keep locked. If there's evidence, it will be there." He paused, observing the growing determination in her eyes. "But it will be very dangerous if they find out you know the truth." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew that the consequences would be devastating, but the girl had made her decision. For months she had been a victim of circumstances, moved from one terrible place to another without any control over her destiny. Now, finally, she had a chance to act. "I'll try," she said with a determination that surprised even herself. "But I need to know. Can you get me out of here when I get the evidence? I have friends, people who are also looking for missing children. As soon as we have proof, we can act." His voice carried a cautious hope. "But are you sure you want to take this risk?" The question echoed in her mind for a few seconds. It was a huge decision for someone her age, but she had grown up quickly during her months of hardship. "The babies need to go back to their families," she said simply, "and I don't want to be sold to bad people." At that moment they heard a door closing inside the mansion. The nanny's phone call had ended, and she would soon discover that her prisoner was not in the room. The girl needed to get back immediately. "Tomorrow at the same time," whispered the man quickly. "If you manage to get to the attic, leave a red ribbon on the tree. If there's danger, leave a black one." She nodded and ran back to the trellis, her ascent being even faster than her descent. The involuntary training of her months on the streets served her well, and in less than 2 minutes she was back in her room, pretending to be focused on the puzzle exactly as the nanny had left her. When the woman appeared at the door a few minutes later, she found a child apparently absorbed in her activities. But there was something different in the air, a tension that the nanny could not fully identify. She watched the girl for a few extra seconds, her eyes searching for signs that something had changed. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her voice laden with suspicion. "Yes, ma'am," replied the girl, with the forced innocence she had perfected. "I'm trying to finish the puzzle before lunch." The nanny continued to watch for a few more moments, then nodded and withdrew. But the girl noticed that she did not close the door completely, leaving a crack that allowed constant observation. From that moment on, her surveillance would be even more intense. That night, during the supervised dinner, the girl observed the businessman with new eyes. Every polished gesture, every caring smile, every gentle word. It was all an elaborate charade to maintain the illusion that he was a benevolent savior. The anger she felt was tempered by the need to keep her discovery a secret until she found the necessary evidence. When she was put to bed with the usual excessive care, she feigned sleep while mentally planning how to access the forbidden attic. She knew she would only have one chance, and failure would mean not only the end of her hopes for freedom, but possibly condemning the babies to a terrible fate. The 4-year-old waif, who had survived the streets, now faced the most dangerous challenge of her young life. The chance to access the attic came totally unexpectedly during a hectic Friday. The businessman had left for an important meeting that, according to the nanny, would last all day. There was a tension in the air that the girl could feel, as if important events were unfolding behind the scenes of her gilded cage. During lunch, the nanny received an urgent call that left her visibly disturbed. The conversation was brief but intense, conducted in a low voice in the hallway, but the girl managed to capture fragments that alarmed her deeply. "It can't be today," the woman said with evident urgency. "We haven't finished the preparations yet." "What do you mean, they're investigating?" "Yes, I understand the situation, but moving everything now would be an unnecessary risk." After the call, the nanny seemed genuinely worried for the first time since arriving at the mansion. Her habitual rounds became more frequent, but also more distracted, as if her mind were focused on bigger problems than supervising a 4-year-old. It was during one of these distracted rounds that the girl noticed something crucial. The nanny had left a set of keys on the table in the main hallway. Among them, there was an old and ornate key that stood out from the others due to its elaborate design. Instinctively, she knew that that was the key to the attic. The opportunity came when the nanny received another call, this one even more urgent than the previous one. The woman locked herself in the businessman's office to have total privacy, and for the first time in weeks, the girl found herself genuinely alone in the mansion. She knew she had perhaps 15 minutes before the constant surveillance was resumed. She took the keys silently, her heart beating so hard that she feared the sound could be heard from the office. The staircase leading to the attic was in an older part of the house, where the wooden floors creaked with any movement. Each step needed to be calculated and silent. The attic door was heavy and old, but the ornate key fit perfectly. The sound of the mechanism opening seemed deafening in the silence of the house, but she knew there was no turning back. She entered quickly and closed the door behind her, plunging into almost total darkness. Her eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the little light that filtered through a small, dusty window. When she managed to see, what she discovered left her breathless. The attic was much larger than she had imagined, and it was organized like a secret office, complete with files, computers, and, most disturbing of all, photographs. The walls were covered with dozens of photos of babies and small children, each accompanied by detailed files with personal information. There were columns for origin, family status, and market value that made her feel nauseous. It was as if she were looking at a human catalogue. On a central table, she found folders organized meticulously with documents that she couldn't read completely, but recognized words like transfer, payment, and final destination. There were also maps marked with locations in different parts of the city, connected by red lines that suggested a complex network. But it was on a side shelf that she made the most shocking discovery. There was a special folder marked with her own name, containing her photo taken secretly during her first days in the mansion, along with detailed assessments of her suitability and potential value. She discovered that she had been classified as essential witness and then secondary product. A computer was on, showing messages that made her blood run cold. Conversations about accelerated timelines, about the need to liquidate the stock quickly due to ongoing investigations, and primarily about her specifically. The waif has become a risk. After the transfer of the primaries, we need to decide on her final destination. She was so absorbed in reading that she almost missed the sound of footsteps approaching the stairs. Panic washed over her when she realized that the nanny's call had ended and that she was climbing up quickly. There was no time to return to her room without being seen. With desperate movements, she grabbed some of the most important photos and hid them inside her blouse. She specifically chose the images of the babies she recognized from the night of the rescue, along with the documents that contained information about destinations and payments. Her photographic memory, developed by the need for survival on the streets, recorded every possible detail. The steps on the stairs were getting closer and closer when she managed to leave the attic and lock the door again. But there was no time to return the keys to their original place. In a desperate impulse, she threw them out the hallway window, hoping that the nanny would think they had fallen accidentally. She ran silently to her room and threw herself on the bed, pretending to be asleep when the nanny appeared at the door. The woman watched for a few seconds, then checked the keys on the hallway table. The sound of her exclamation of frustration when she discovered they had disappeared echoed through the house. "Where are the keys?" murmured the nanny to herself, searching frantically. When she found them in the garden under the window, she assumed they had fallen accidentally during her agitation with the urgent calls. During the rest of the afternoon, the girl struggled to maintain her composure while processing everything she had discovered. The evidence hidden in her clothes seemed to burn against her skin, and every look from the nanny made her fear that her discovery would be noticed. When it was time for dinner, the businessman had returned, but his appearance was very different from usual. He was visibly tense, his movements were abrupt, and there was a forced quality to his usual cordiality. During the meal, he received several calls that he answered with short and coded responses. "Situation controlled," he said in one of the calls. "Transfer scheduled for tomorrow night. Yes, including all elements." The word all resonated in the girl's mind terrifyingly. It didn't refer only to the babies, but also to her. Her presence had ceased to be useful and now represented a risk that needed to be eliminated. That night, when she was put to bed under the extra supervision of the nanny, she knew that that might be her last opportunity to act. The evidence she had collected needed to reach the man from the neighboring garden, and she needed to find a way to escape before the plan was executed. Pretending to sleep, she waited until she was sure that the nanny had fallen asleep. The risk of another nighttime expedition was enormous, but there was no alternative. With the photographs and documents firmly hidden in her clothes, she began to mentally plan the safest route to reach the tree. but when she headed silently toward the window, she discovered that its locks had been replaced by much more complex ones. The nanny had suspected something and taken extra precautions. The girl was officially a prisoner, and the time for her transfer was running out quickly. Lying in the luxurious bed that had become her cell, she pressed the evidence against her chest and closed her eyes, trying to find the strength to face what might be the last day of her life as a free child. The final battle was about to begin, and she knew that not everyone would come out of this terrible situation alive. Saturday dawned with an atmosphere of palpable urgency that permeated every corner of the mansion. The girl woke up to the sound of agitated voices coming from the lower floor, conversations conducted in low tones but charged with tension. For the first time since the nanny had arrived, she did not appear immediately in the room with breakfast and the usual routine. Taking advantage of this unusual break in the constant surveillance, the girl approached the door and managed to hear fragments of the discussions that were taking place downstairs. The businessman was clearly under pressure, his normally controlled voice now laden with irritation and fear. "How did they get a warrant?" she heard him say. "That was supposed to be impossible with our connections. No, we can't just cancel everything now. There's too much money involved." The nanny's response was indistinct, but her tone suggested that she was arguing for caution. There were other voices too. People the girl didn't recognize, talking about escape routes, compromising evidence, and accelerated timelines. When the nanny finally appeared in the room, an hour later than usual, she was visibly agitated. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a frantic quality to her movements that contrasted with the cold efficiency she had previously demonstrated. "Change of plans today," she announced without preamble. "You're staying in the room all day. No classes, no garden, no nothing. There's renovations happening in the house that may be dangerous for children." The lie was so obvious that it was insulting, but the girl nodded obediently. She had learned that feigning submission was often the best way to obtain information and opportunities. The nanny brought a tray with enough food for several meals, as if she were preparing for a prolonged absence. "Don't leave this room for any reason," emphasized the woman, her voice laden with a threat that didn't need to be explicit. "Any disobedience will have very serious consequences." After the nanny left, the girl watched through the window the intense activity in the garden. There were men carrying boxes and documents into dark vans parked in the circular driveway. The activity resembled an evacuation, as if they were removing evidence or preparing to abandon the property. Most disturbing was that she couldn't see the man from the neighboring garden. His absence worried her deeply, especially considering that he had promised to be watching. Had he been discovered? Was he in danger because of her? The possibilities terrified her. During the afternoon, the activity in the mansion intensified even more. She could hear vehicles arriving and departing constantly, agitated voices in the hallways, and most of all, the sound of things being moved hurriedly. It was as if the whole operation was being dismantled in a matter of hours. It was then that something happened that completely changed the situation. Through the window, she saw a van different from the others approaching the property. This one was not black and discreet like the previous ones, but white and marked with symbols that she recognized vaguely. When she saw uniformed people getting out of the vehicle, she understood that someone had finally come to investigate. The reaction inside the house was immediate and chaotic. Footsteps running through the corridors, doors slamming, and most of all, the businessman's voice shouting contradictory orders to different people. The nanny appeared in the girl's room with an expression of barely disguised panic. "Change of plans again," she said, trying to keep her voice calm but failing completely. "We're going on a trip. Now. Just take what's essential." The girl knew that this trip would be irreversible. The evidence she had collected from the attic was still hidden in her clothes, but there was no way to hand it over to the investigators if she was removed from the property immediately. She needed a desperate plan. "Can I go to the bathroom first?" she asked in the most innocent voice possible, "and maybe get my favorite teddy bear?" The nanny hesitated, clearly torn between the urgency of the situation and the need to maintain a normal appearance. "Quick," she finally agreed. 2 minutes, no more. In the bathroom, the girl acted with the speed developed during her months of survival on the streets. She took the photographs and documents hidden in her clothes and wrapped them in toilet paper, creating a small but visible package. Her only hope was to manage to leave the evidence somewhere where the investigators would find it. When she left the bathroom, she pretended to trip accidentally near the hallway window. During the stage fall, she managed to throw the package of evidence through a gap in the window that faced the main garden where the investigators were working. The nanny helped her up with a forced gentleness, clearly anxious to leave the house as quickly as possible. "Your teddy bear can wait for later," she said, guiding the girl quickly down the stairs. "We have to go now." Downstairs, the scene was one of complete, controlled chaos. The businessman was in the main room, feigning total cooperation with the investigators, his mask of respectable citizen firmly in place. When he saw the girl coming down the stairs, his smile widened with a theatricality that made her feel nauseous. "Ah, my dear," he said loudly, clearly for the benefit of the visitors. "I was worried that all this commotion had scared you. These gentlemen are just people asking questions about that terrible night when I saved you." One of the investigators, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, squatted down to be at her level. "Hi, little one. Can you tell me what you remember about the night you met this gentleman?" It was the crucial moment. The girl looked quickly at the businessman and the nanny, seeing the barely disguised tension on their faces. They were clearly expecting her to confirm the rehearsed version of events, but she had made her decision. "I remember everything," she said with a clarity that surprised everyone present. "I remember the men in hoods, the hole, the babies who were crying." The businessman tried to interrupt with a nervous laugh. Children sometimes confuse traumatic details. Memory can be... "I remember that it wasn't real," continued the girl, completely ignoring the attempt to interrupt. "It was all faked, and I threw important papers out the window a few minutes ago." The silence that followed was deafening. The investigator looked directly into the child's eyes, recognizing the truth he saw there. The businessman and the nanny seemed to have been turned into statues, their expressions frozen between shock and terror. "What kind of papers?" asked the investigator gently. "Photos of the babies they took, photos of other children too, and papers with numbers and names." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "They wanted to sell me too. I heard them talking about buyers." The explosion of activity that followed was instantaneous. More investigators were called, the property was officially sealed off, and the search for the mentioned evidence began immediately. The businessman tried to maintain his facade of outraged innocence, but his hands were trembling visibly. The nanny, realizing that the game was over, made one last desperate attempt to control the situation. "The child is confused," she said with an authority that sounded increasingly false. "She has gone through traumas and—" "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to remain silent while we conduct our investigation," interrupted the investigator with professional firmness. At that moment, one of the agents who had been sent to search the garden returned with the package of evidence that the girl had thrown out the window. When they opened the improvised bundle and saw the photographs and documents, everyone's expression changed to a deadly seriousness. "This is evidence of a much larger operation," said the chief investigator, examining the materials. "We're going to need a complete team here." The girl watched as her gilded cage turned into an official crime scene. For the first time in months, she felt that she might actually be safe. But she knew that the battle wasn't completely over yet. The babies still needed to be found, and the people responsible for this entire operation still needed to be brought to justice. The revelation of the evidence transformed the mansion into a center of intensive investigation. Specialized teams arrived constantly, each focused on different aspects of the criminal operation that had been exposed. The girl was carefully separated from the chaos and placed under the protection of an experienced social worker, a gentle woman who patiently explained each step of the process. During the preliminary interrogations, the complete truth began to emerge even more shockingly than she had imagined. The businessman, confronted with irrefutable evidence, eventually collapsed and began to reveal details about a network that extended far beyond the luxurious mansion. "It wasn't my idea," he repeated constantly, his hands trembling as he spoke. "I was being blackmailed, forced to participate. My company, my assets, everything was at risk if I didn't cooperate." But the evidence from the attic told a different story. The documents showed that he had voluntarily invested large sums of money in the operation, treating child trafficking like any other profitable business. His financial applications included quotas in different products, a terrible euphemism for referring to the kidnapped babies. The nanny, when finally interrogated separately, revealed even more disturbing information. She was not just an accomplice. She was one of the main organizers of the entire operation. Her maternal appearance and experience with children made her perfect for gaining the trust of vulnerable families before carrying out the kidnappings. "It had been working like this for years," she explained with a coldness that chilled the blood. "Poor families, single mothers, people without the resources to fight back. It was a clean and efficient business." The investigations revealed that they operated through fake charitable organizations, offering temporary help to families in crisis and then simply disappearing with the children. The rescue that the girl had witnessed was staged specifically to create an innocent witness who would validate their version to the authorities. But the most shocking discovery came when the investigators finally located the safe house where the babies were being kept. The location was on the outskirts of the city, a seemingly ordinary property that hid a sophisticated temporary care operation while the products were prepared for transfer. The girl was taken to identify the children, an experience that traumatized her deeply, but that was essential to gather evidence. When she saw the 3 babies she had helped to save on that terrible night, her memories crystallized with painful clarity. They were well cared for physically, but there was something in their looks that suggested deep trauma. It was during this identification that she finally found the man from the neighboring garden. He was among a group of desperate parents who had been called in to potentially recognize their lost children. When their eyes met, she saw relief, gratitude, and a pain that was finally finding resolution. "Thank you," he said simply, kneeling down to be at her level. "You saved my son. You saved all these children." His baby was among those who were found in the safe house, malnourished but alive. The reunion between father and son was a moment of pure emotion that made even the most experienced investigators tear up. But not all families were so lucky. Some children had already been transferred to buyers in other cities. During the following weeks, as the investigation deepened, the full extent of the operation was revealed. There were buyers in multiple states, a sophisticated transportation network, and connections with influential people who had used their power to protect the operation. The businessman's fortune, built partly with profits from trafficking, was confiscated to compensate the victims. The girl had to testify multiple times, always accompanied by professionals specializing in child trauma. Her photographic memory, which had been crucial for her survival on the streets, now became fundamental to dismantling the criminal network completely. She could remember faces, names, conversations, and details that adults would have forgotten. But perhaps the most painful discovery for her personally was learning that her own presence in that vacant lot that night had not been coincidental. The nanny had been watching street children for weeks, looking for one who was young enough to be manipulated, but old enough to be a credible witness. "She was chosen specifically," explained one of the investigators to the social worker responsible for her. "They knew about her situation. They knew there was no one looking for her. She was the perfect witness to validate the theater they staged. This revelation was devastating for the girl, who had spent months believing that at least the initial moment of her salvation had been genuine. Discovering that even that had been calculated and false made her question whether any adult in her life had ever acted with genuine kindness. It was during this period of deep depression that she met the therapist who would change her perspective on everything. The doctor was a woman, experienced in child trauma, who had worked with victims of similar situations. Her approach was gentle but direct, helping the girl process not only the recent trauma, but also years of abandonment and survival. "You were very brave," said the therapist during one of their sessions, "not only for reporting what was happening, but for surviving all this with your humanity intact." "But I didn't save anyone," replied the girl, her small voice laden with doubt. "They used me to make bad things happen. You were used, yes, but when you discovered the truth, you chose to act to protect other children. That choice came from your heart, not from their plans." Gradually, through intensive therapy and specialized care, the girl began to understand that she had been a victim, not an accomplice. Her ability to distinguish right from wrong, even in impossible circumstances, was evidence of an inner strength that no trauma could completely destroy. Meanwhile, the trials of the criminals began to attract national attention. The case became a symbol of the vulnerability of children in at-risk situations and the need for more effective protection systems. The girl, always protected by court order to preserve her identity, inadvertently became an icon of childhood courage. But for her, the most important thing was knowing that the babies were being reunited with their true families. Each reunion she witnessed or heard about made her feel that her own pain had served for something greater. She was learning that suffering could be transformed into purpose, and that even the most terrible experiences could result in something positive. However, one question still remained unanswered, one that she was terrified to ask, but that needed to be faced. What would happen to her now? Where would a 4-year-old who had gone through so much trauma find a true home? The answer to that question would come in a way she never could have imagined, bringing hope just when she needed it most. During the months that followed the dismantling of the criminal network, the girl lived in a temporary home specializing in traumatized children. The place was run by a team of experienced professionals who understood the complexities of her unique situation. She had become the main witness in a case that continued to unfold, with new arrests happening regularly. Each week, there were new, disturbing discoveries about the extent of the operation. Investigators from different states arrived to interview her, always accompanied by her therapist and social worker. Her exceptional memory continued to provide crucial clues that led to more rescues and arrests. But the emotional weight of being the center of so much attention began to deeply affect her well-being. It was during one of these interviews that something unexpected happened. One of the investigators, a younger man who had recently joined the case, seemed to recognize her in a way that went beyond her role as a witness. He kept watching her with a strange intensity, as if he were trying to solve a personal puzzle. "Can I ask a question not related to the case?" he said to the social worker after finishing the official interrogation. "About her personal history before all this started." The social worker hesitated, but something in the seriousness of his expression convinced her to allow a few additional questions. The investigator knelt in front of the girl, his eyes gentle but laden with an emotion she couldn't identify. "Do you remember the name of your parents?" he asked carefully, "or any detail about them that could help to locate them?" The question touched on memories that the girl had tried to bury. "They passed in the accident," she said simply, using the euphemistic language she had learned to deal with the loss. "I don't have any family anymore." "But do you remember their names, or where you lived before?" With hesitation, she shared the few details she could remember. Names that sounded familiar but distant, fragments of an address, small details about the life she had had before the streets. The investigator noted everything meticulously, his expression becoming more intense with each piece of information. 2 weeks later, he returned with news that changed everything. He had discovered that the accident she remembered had not been fatal for everyone involved. Her maternal grandmother, who had been listed as missing in the confusion after the accident, had actually survived but had been in a coma for months. When she finally woke up, she began a desperate search for the granddaughter who had disappeared from the system. "She never stopped looking for you," explained the investigator, his voice laden with emotion. "She spent all her savings hiring private investigators, distributing flyers, following any possible lead. When she heard about this case and saw your description," the girl could barely process the information. During all those months of trauma and loneliness, had someone really been looking for her? Someone who genuinely loved her and wanted her back? The possibility seemed too good to be true. The meeting was carefully organized in the temporary home, with psychologists present to help with what could be an emotionally overwhelming experience. When the door opened and a grey-haired lady entered hesitantly, the girl felt something deep stir in her memory. The woman was approximately 60 years old, but her face carried the marks of months of constant worry. Her clothes were simple but clean, and there was a fragility in her movements that suggested health problems. But when her eyes met the girl's, a complete transformation happened. "My little one," whispered the grandmother, tears streaming freely down her face. "I knew you were still alive. I knew it." The memories came back in waves. The girl remembered the smell of homemade cookies, stories told before bed, gentle care during colds. This woman was not a stranger. She was true family, someone who had loved and cared for her before the world fell apart. "Grandma?" she said tentatively, the word coming out naturally despite the months of separation. The hug that followed was charged with years of pain, fear, and relief. The grandmother held her granddaughter as if she feared she might disappear again, while the girl allowed herself to feel a safety she had not experienced since before the accident. "I'm going to take care of you now," promised the grandmother, her voice firm despite the tears. "We're never going to separate again, never again." But the reunion was not without complications. The grandmother had developed serious health problems during the months of desperate searching, and her financial situation was precarious due to spending on private investigators. The small apartment where she lived barely had room for a child, and her retirement income would be insufficient to provide the specialized care that the girl would need. "I want to take her home," said the grandmother during a meeting with the social worker, "but I know I may not have the resources to give her everything she needs." It was then that something completely unexpected happened. The man from the neighboring garden, whose baby had been rescued thanks to the girl's courage, appeared at the meeting. He had been following the case and found out about the family's situation. "I want to help," he announced simply. "This child saved my son. Now it's my turn to repay." His proposal was generous and practical. He offered to supplement the grandmother's income, ensuring that the girl had access to medical care, quality education, and continued therapy. Not as charity, but as recognition of a debt that could never be fully repaid. "She gave me back my son," he explained to the social worker. "Now I want to help ensure that she has the family she deserves." Other families whose babies had been rescued joined the initiative. Together, they created a support network that would ensure that the girl and her grandmother would never again be in need. It was a community formed through tragedy, but united by gratitude and determination to transform suffering into hope. The legal process to transfer official custody to the grandmother took some months, during which the girl made regular visits that gradually became sleepovers and then extended stays. Each day in the company of her grandmother brought back more memories of her previous life, building a bridge between who she had been and who she was becoming. Therapy continued, but now with a focus on family integration and healing within a genuinely loving environment. The therapist observed with satisfaction how the girl flourished when surrounded by unconditional love and real stability. "It's impressive how well she's recovering," commented the professional during a family session. "Having a solid foundation of love makes all the difference in the healing process." But perhaps the most significant moment came when the girl, finally safe in her grandmother's small but cozy apartment, made a statement that summed up her extraordinary journey. "Grandma," she said one night while they were being put to sleep in the same bed due to lack of space, "I went through very bad things, but they brought me back to you." The simplicity and wisdom of the observation touched the grandmother deeply, who realized that her granddaughter had emerged from the trauma not only a survivor, but transformed into someone with a deep understanding of purpose and resilience. That night, for the first time in almost a year, the girl slept truly in peace, knowing that she was exactly where she belonged. But her story was far from over. The events that would follow would show that even seemingly perfect endings can hide surprises that will test her newfound strength even further. 6 months after reuniting with her grandmother, the girl was adjusting well to her new life when an unexpected discovery shook her reality again. During a routine visit to the courthouse to finalize some legal aspects of the case, she overheard a conversation between lawyers that left her deeply disturbed. "The problem is that we've discovered evidence that there were more people involved in the operation," said one of the prosecutors. "People who are still free and may represent a threat to the main witness." The main witness was her, and knowing that there was still danger made her relive all the fears she thought she had overcome. The grandmother, who had noticed changes in her granddaughter's behavior, finally managed to extract from her what she had heard. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you," promised the grandmother, but her own worry was evident. The small apartment that had become a haven now seemed vulnerable and exposed. Security measures were implemented gradually. First came the regular checks by agents specializing in witness protection, then changes to the daily routine to make their movements less predictable. The girl, who had finally found stability, saw her life again filled with precautions and limitations. It was during this tense period that she began to notice strange details that no one else noticed. A man who appeared frequently near the school where she had started studying. A car that she saw repeatedly parked in different locations, but always with the same driver. Her experience on the streets had sharpened her survival instincts, and these instincts now screamed alarms. "Someone's following us," she told her grandmother one afternoon after school. "The same man from yesterday, and the blue car, too." The grandmother initially tried to reassure her, attributing her observations to the trauma that had not yet completely healed. But when she mentioned the details to the protection agents, they took the observations very seriously. The girl had demonstrated an exceptional ability to perceive patterns and anomalies. The investigation confirmed her fears. There were indeed people monitoring their movements, probably connected to the still unresolved aspects of the criminal network. Some of the most powerful people involved in the operation had never been identified, and apparently saw the girl as a threat that needed to be silenced. "We need to consider temporary relocation," informed the responsible agent during an emergency meeting, "until we can identify and neutralize these threats." The idea of another move, another separation from everything she had managed to rebuild, devastated the girl. She refused to eat, spent nights awake, and developed nightmares that she hadn't had in months. The stability that had been so crucial for her recovery was again being threatened. It was then that the man from the neighboring garden, who had become a substitute father figure, proposed a different solution. Instead of hiding the girl, why not use her exceptional intelligence to help capture the remaining criminals? "She has a unique ability to observe and remember details," he argued during a meeting with the entire protection team. "Instead of treating her only as a victim, why don't we involve her as an active collaborator?" The proposal was controversial and risky, but it also recognized the reality that the girl had demonstrated extraordinary courage and intelligence. After much debate, a plan was developed that would allow her to assist in the investigation while remaining protected. The plan involved allowing the criminals to continue thinking they had access to her, but under constant and controlled surveillance. She would continue her normal routine, but with invisible protection and monitoring devices that would allow the authorities to map the entire network of people involved in the surveillance. "It's like using me as bait," said the girl, demonstrating a mature understanding of the situation. "But this time I know it's a trap, and I'm helping to make the trap." During the following weeks, she became an active collaborator in the operation. Her ability to observe details that adults missed, combined with her experience of survival on the streets, made her an invaluable source of information. She identified patterns of surveillance, recognized faces in crowds, and perceived subtle changes in her environment. But perhaps her most significant contribution came when she noticed something that none of the investigators had noticed. During her careful observations, she discovered that one of the protection agents assigned to take care of her was passing information to the criminals. "He always knows where we're going before we get there," she observed during a family meeting with her grandmother and the therapist. "And he always has excuses not to be around when strange things happen." The revelation of a corrupt agent within the protection team itself was devastating, but it also explained how the criminals managed to maintain such effective surveillance. An internal investigation was opened, and it was discovered that the agent had been bribed with significant amounts of money to provide information about the girl's movements. With the corrupt agent removed and the surveillance network finally mapped, the authorities could act decisively. In a coordinated operation that involved multiple agencies, the remaining criminals were captured in a single night. The girl watched from a safe location, through monitors, while the people who had threatened her new life were finally brought to justice. The arrest of the last criminals marked the official end of her life as a protected witness, but also the beginning of a new phase of her existence. She had demonstrated not only survival, but leadership and courage that impressed all the adults involved in the case. "You are no longer just a victim who was saved," said her therapist during a special session after the end of the threats. "You have become someone who saves other people." The observation touched something deep within the girl. For months, she had struggled with feelings of powerlessness and victimization. Discovering that she could use her experiences to protect other children gave new meaning to all the suffering she had endured. It was then that she made a decision that surprised all the adults around her. She wanted to use her story to help other children in similar situations. She wanted to become a voice for those who could not speak for themselves. "When I grow up," she announced during a family meeting, "I want to work protecting children like I was protected." The simplicity and determination of her statement deeply touched everyone present. A 4-year-old who had survived unimaginable trauma was not only recovering, she was transforming into someone dedicated to preventing other children from going through the same suffering. But there was still one last surprise waiting for her, a discovery that would change her understanding about family and belonging in ways she never could have imagined. The truth was about to be revealed, and with it, an ending that would be more extraordinary than anything she had experienced in her journey up to that point. The final revelation came in a completely unexpected way during a quiet Sunday morning. The girl was helping her grandmother organize some old boxes that had been recovered from the destroyed house in the accident when she found a yellowed envelope hidden at the bottom of a box of family documents. "Grandma, what's this?" she asked, holding the envelope that had her name written on it in handwriting she didn't recognize. The grandmother took the envelope with trembling hands, her expression changing drastically when she recognized the writing. This is from your mom," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "She left it for you before the accident." Inside the envelope, there was a letter and several photographs that told a story that no one had shared with the girl before. The photos showed her mother during her pregnancy, but also revealed something surprising. There was another person in the images, a young man who was clearly emotionally involved with her mother. "Who is he, Grandma?" asked the girl, pointing to the man in the photographs. The grandmother hesitated for a long moment before answering. "He's your father, my dear, your true father." The revelation was shocking. All this time, the girl had assumed that both parents had passed in the accident. Discovering that her father could be alive opened a whole world of possibilities that she had not considered. The mother's letter explained the complex situation. The girl's father was a young and responsible man who had offered to take care of both of them, but the mother had chosen to raise her daughter alone for reasons that she promised to explain when the child was older. The letter also contained contact information and an explanation about where he could be found. "Why didn't she ever tell me about him?" asked the girl, trying to process this new information. "Your mother thought it was better to wait until you were older to understand," explained the grandmother. "She wanted to protect you from complicated situations." With the help of the same investigators who had worked on the criminal case, they managed to locate the girl's father. They discovered that he had spent years looking for her and her mother, unaware of the accident or anything that had happened afterwards. The man was now a teacher in a nearby town, had married and had a family of his own, but had never forgotten his first daughter. When he received the call informing him that she was alive and that they wanted to arrange a meeting, his reaction was of shock and joy impossible to describe. "I never stopped thinking about her," he said during the first telephone conversation with the grandmother. "Every day I wondered where she was, if she was okay, if I would ever be able to meet her." The first meeting was carefully arranged, with the presence of the therapist and in a neutral environment where the girl felt safe. When her father entered the room, she immediately saw the physical similarities that had been inherited. The same eyes, the same shape of the face, gestures that seemed familiar, even though she had never seen them before. "Hi," he said simply, his voice trembling with emotion. "I'm your dad." The girl observed him carefully, using the same ability to read people that she had developed during her months of survival. She saw no falsehood or ulterior motives, just genuine love and a deep pain for years of forced separation. "You look like me," she said finally, an observation that made everyone in the room smile through tears. During the conversations that followed, she discovered that she had half-siblings, two younger children who had always known about her and dreamed of meeting her one day. Her father had told his new family about his first daughter, keeping her memory alive, even not knowing her whereabouts. But perhaps the most extraordinary discovery came when she learned that her father had dedicated his career to working with children in at-risk situations. He had become a teacher, specifically to help children who were going through hardships, a vocation that had been born from his own experience of loss and separation. "It's as if you two had followed the same path," observed the therapist during a family session. Both dedicated themselves to protecting children, each in their own way. The integration of the girl into two families who loved her became a delicate but rewarding process. She began to divide her time between her grandmother's small but cozy house and the larger house where her father lived with his new family. Surprisingly, there was no conflict or competition, only multiplied love. Her half-siblings, 4 years old each, received her with the unconditional acceptance typical of children. They had grown up hearing stories about the older sister who would one day come home, and her arrival was seen as the fulfillment of a family dream. "Now our family is complete," said one of the brothers during a family dinner, a simple observation that perfectly captured everyone's sentiment. The stepmother, a gentle woman who had dreamed of meeting her stepdaughter since she got married, became another source of support and love. She understood that her role was not to replace the mother the girl had lost, but to offer a different type of maternal care. During this period of family adaptation, the girl continued her therapy, but now with a focus on integrating all these new relationships and building an identity that incorporated all parts of her experience. She was no longer just the traumatized girl who had survived the streets, nor just the courageous witness who had helped dismantle a criminal network. "You're becoming someone unique," said her therapist. "Someone who understands suffering but also knows love, who has lived trauma but also experienced healing." The girl began to realize that her extraordinary journey had given her perspectives that few people of any age possessed. She understood vulnerability and strength, knew how to identify danger, but also how to recognize genuine kindness. When she turned 5, she had a birthday party that brought together everyone who had been important in her journey. The grandmother, the father and his new family, the man from the neighboring garden and his rescued baby, other families who had been reunited through her courage, and even some of the investigators who had become friends. "Look how many people love you," said the grandmother, observing the room full of people who had been touched by the girl's life. "And look how many people I helped to find each other too," she replied, demonstrating a wisdom that transcended her age. At that moment, surrounded by so much love and so many connections that she had helped to create or restore, the girl finally understood the true meaning of her journey. She had not only survived, she had become a catalyst for the healing and reunion of countless families. But the story had not yet come to an end. There was one last surprise waiting, one that would transform not only her life, but also offer an opportunity to touch the lives of many other children in a way she never could have imagined. 2 years after reuniting with her father, when the girl had already turned 6, an unexpected proposal arrived that would change not only her life, but potentially the lives of hundreds of other children. A group of organizations specializing in child protection had followed her story through the trials and media coverage and wanted to offer a unique opportunity. "They want to create a special program," explained her therapist during a family session that included the grandmother, the father, and the stepmother. "A program where children who have gone through similar traumas can help other children in at-risk situations." The proposal was revolutionary in its simplicity. Recognizing that the girl possessed an exceptional ability to identify signs of danger and understand the needs of traumatized children, they wanted to develop a system where she could train professionals and even help directly in specific cases. "It would be like having a special consultant," continued the therapist, "someone who understands both the victim's side and the investigation side." The idea initially caused anxiety in the whole family. They had fought so hard to give the girl a normal and stable life that the prospect of involving her again in traumatic situations seemed counterproductive. But when they asked her opinion, her response surprised them. "I want to help," she said, with the determination that she had demonstrated since she was little. "Other children shouldn't go through what I went through alone." Her emotional maturity and her understanding of the implications of the proposal impressed all the adults present. She was not reacting impulsively, but carefully considering how she could use her experiences to prevent suffering in other children. The program was developed gradually, with strict safeguards to protect the girl's well-being. She would participate only in selected cases, always accompanied by specialized professionals, and would never be exposed directly to dangerous situations. Her role would be advisory, using her unique perspective to help investigators better understand what the child victims were experiencing. The first case in which she became involved was particularly significant. A 5-year-old child had been found in similar conditions to those she had experienced, but refused to speak to any adult. The professionals were frustrated because they could not obtain information necessary to protect the child adequately. "She's scared," observed the girl, after observing the child through a one-way mirror. "But it's not fear of bad adults. It's fear that the good adults won't believe her." Her observation proved to be accurate. When they finally gained the child's trust, they discovered that she had tried to tell about her situation to several adults previously, but had been ignored or disbelieved. The experience had taught her that it was safer to remain silent. "How did you know that?" asked the main investigator. "Because I had that fear too," she replied simply. "When you're little and no one listens, you stop trying to speak." Her ability to translate the fears and behaviors of traumatized children to adults who wanted to help proved to be invaluable. In case after case, she provided insights that allowed professionals to connect with young victims in ways that had previously been impossible. But perhaps her most significant contribution was the development of a special protocol for interviewing traumatized children. Based on her own experiences and observations, she helped to create guidelines that made the process less traumatic and more effective. "Children need to know that you really believe them before they tell you the bad secrets," she explained during a training session for investigators. "And they need to know that you won't be angry with them for what happened." Her work began to attract national attention. Articles were written about the child consultant, who was revolutionizing the way professionals handled cases of child abuse. Universities invited her to speak about her experiences and insights, always with the care to protect her identity and well-being. During this period, she maintained her normal life as a 6-year-old. She attended regular school, played with her half-siblings, spent time with her grandmother, and participated in typical childhood activities. Her family had found a balance that allowed her to use her unique talents without sacrificing her normal development. "She's extraordinary," observed her father during a meeting with the entire team of professionals. "But she's still a child, and we want her to have the childhood she deserves." It was during one of those normal childhood activities that something happened that brought her journey full circle. She was playing in a nearby park when she noticed a small child, appearing about 3 years old, wandering alone and clearly in a state of distress. Her instincts, developed through personal experience and professional training, immediately alerted her that something was wrong. The child was clean and well-dressed, but there was something in her expression and behavior that suggested recent trauma. "Dad," she said, pulling on her father's sleeve, "that child is lost, but not in the normal way." Her father, who had learned to completely trust his daughter's instincts, immediately paid attention. Together, they approached the child carefully, who was crying silently near a tree. "Hi," said the girl gently, crouching down to be at the same height as the smaller child. "Are you okay?" The child looked at her with huge eyes full of fear, but something in the gentle voice and non-threatening posture of the girl made her relax slightly. In a few minutes, using techniques she had learned through her consulting work, she managed to discover that the child had been separated from someone who was taking care of her in a way that didn't seem appropriate. The authorities were contacted, and it was discovered that the child had been kidnapped hours before by someone with criminal intentions. The kidnapper had been scared by something and fled, leaving the victim behind. If the girl had not recognized the signs and acted quickly, the situation could have had a tragic outcome. "You saved another child," said the investigator who responded to the call, a man who had worked with her on previous cases. "And this time, it wasn't part of an official program. It was just you being you." That night, as the family celebrated another child saved through the girl's extraordinary intuition and courage, she made an observation that perfectly summed up her journey of transformation. "I think this is my job in life," she said as she was being put to sleep, "helping children who are lost to find their way home." Her words touched deeply all who heard them because they encapsulated not only her personal mission, but also the broader meaning of her experience. She had transformed her own suffering into a purpose that benefited countless other people, but there was still one last surprise waiting for her, one that would offer the opportunity to expand her impact in ways that not even she could have imagined. The final chapter of her extraordinary journey was about to begin. 3 years later, when the girl turned 9, her life had found an extraordinary balance between normality and exceptional purpose. She attended school like any child her age, but also maintained her consulting work that had helped to solve dozens of cases and save countless children. Her reputation as the little investigator had spread discreetly among specialized professionals throughout the country. It was during a spring morning, while she was helping her grandmother in the small garden they had created in the apartment, that they received a visit that would change everything once again. An elegantly dressed man, accompanied by a woman who exuded professional authority, appeared at the door with a proposal that none of them had anticipated. "We represent an international foundation dedicated to child protection," explained the woman after the initial introductions. "We have been following the exceptional work of your granddaughter for some time now." The proposal they brought was as ambitious as it was unexpected. They wanted to create the first world training center for professionals working with traumatized children, and they wanted the girl to be the main consultant for the project, not just offering occasional insights, but effectively helping to develop new methods and protocols that could be used globally. "It would be a long-term commitment," explained the man, "but also an opportunity to positively impact thousands of children in situations similar to what she lived." The whole family was convened for discussions that lasted for weeks. The father, the stepmother, the grandmother, the therapist, and even the half-siblings participated in the conversations about how this opportunity could affect everyone's lives. The final decision, as always, would be the girl's own. "It's very big," she said initially, demonstrating an impressive maturity in considering the implications. "But if it can help many children..." What impressed her most in the proposal was discovering that children from other countries went through similar experiences to hers, and that the methods she had helped to develop could be adapted for different cultures and situations. The idea that her suffering could be transformed into something that benefited children around the world deeply moved her. "Can I continue living with my family?" was her first practical question. "Of course," replied the woman from the foundation. "In fact, we insist on it. Your family stability is an essential part of what makes your work so effective." The center would be built in the same city where she lived, allowing her to maintain her family routines while significantly expanding her impact. There would be facilities for training, research, and even temporary accommodation for professionals who came from other countries to learn her methods. During the planning months, the girl actively involved herself in the design of the center. Her suggestions included special rooms for interviews with traumatized children, recreation areas that would help victims to feel safe, and primarily a therapeutic garden where children could begin to process their traumas in a natural and comforting environment. "Children feel safer when there are plants and flowers around," she explained to the architects. "Beautiful places help to remember that the world is not all bad." Her unique perspective continued to surprise the adult professionals. Details that no specialist had considered became obvious when seen through the eyes of someone who had experienced so much trauma and healing. When the center finally opened 2 years later, it immediately became an international model. Professionals from every continent arrived to learn techniques that combined scientific methodology with deeply human insights. The girl, now 11 years old, conducted training sessions that were recorded and distributed globally. "What makes her work so special," commented a visiting psychologist from Europe, "is that she understands both the victim's side and the healing side. She can explain not only what happens to traumatized children, but how to help them in ways that really work." During this period, she also began to write. With the help of a specialized journalist, she developed a series of manuals for professionals and even children's books that helped children to process traumas. Her writings were translated into multiple languages and used in child protection programs around the world. But perhaps her most significant contribution was the development of what became known as the Trust Protocol, a revolutionary method for establishing communication with severely traumatized children. The protocol was based on her own experiences and had demonstrated extraordinary effectiveness in cases where traditional methods failed. She literally rewrote how we understand childhood trauma, said her therapist during an international conference. And she did this not through academic theory, but through lived wisdom. At 12 years old, the girl received official recognition for her work. International organizations honored her with awards traditionally reserved for adults, always with the understanding that her personal well-being remained the top priority. "It's strange to receive awards for things that happened to me," she said during a ceremony, "but if it helps more people to pay attention to children who need help, then it's worth it." Her family had grown in unexpected ways during these years. The man from the neighboring garden, whose baby she had helped to save years before, had effectively become an uncle. Several of the families reunited through her work maintained regular contact, creating an extended network of people connected by shared experiences of loss and recovery. During a celebration dinner for her 13th birthday, surrounded by more than 50 people whose lives had been touched by her courage and dedication, the girl made a reflection that perfectly captured her extraordinary journey. "When I was little and alone on the streets," she said, looking around the room full of love and connections, "I thought that my life had ended before it had even begun. I didn't know that I was just preparing to start in a way I never could have imagined." Her words touched deeply all those present, because they summed up not only her own transformation, but also the power of human resilience and the ability to transform suffering into purpose. That night, as she was being put to sleep by the grandmother who never stopped looking for her, she looked out the window at the city where her journey had begun so traumatically. Now, that same city housed a center that was changing the way the world protected its most vulnerable children. "Grandma," she said sleepily, "I think I finally understand why all that had to happen." "Why, my dear?" "Because someone needed to know what it's like to be lost, so she could teach other people how to help lost children find their way home." The simplicity and depth of her understanding perfectly summarized a journey that had begun with a 4-year-old girl wandering alone on the streets and culminated with a 13-year-old who had dedicated her life to ensuring that other children never went through similar experiences alone. Her story had become proof that even the most difficult beginnings can lead to the most extraordinary endings, and that suffering can be transformed into a purpose that benefits countless other people. The girl who had once been a silent victim had become a powerful voice for all the children who needed to be heard and protected. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment on what you thought of my story, giving a score from 0 to 10. And thank you very much.